Geopolitics in Empire is joined by investigative journalist Kit Klarenberg. He writes for Russia Today, Grey Zone, Covert Action magazine, and other publications. We'll be talking about the Pandora papers, the fake Facebook whistleblower, and Russia designating Bellingcat and others as foreign agents. Basically, this information war that is kicking into high gear. Thanks for joining the podcast, Kit. How is life on Airstrip 1 or wherever you may be?
Well, I'm in the former Yugoslavia, but I know things are pretty sweet. There's a distinct lack of coronavirus restrictions, which is always welcome. There's another lockdown, no doubt, coming in my native country of the UK very soon, and vaccine passports. So I'm happy to be closer to the mountains. At this stage.
Well, yeah, all right. As what is it, Bruce Dickinson, Iron Maiden say, run to the hills.
Sorry, go on.
Every few years, we keep getting these same type of leaks, right, from the same type of organizations targeting the same type of individuals. Last time it was Panama Papers. Before that, the Paradise Papers. Now it's Pandora Papers. And they're not really that imaginative in their branding. The source of these leaks, in my opinion, are generally Western government intelligence-controlled propaganda outlets like the Guardian, New York Times, and so on. And they come from NGOs sponsored and funded generally by Western governments and actors like Soros. I think a lot of us know the usual suspects. I kind of view this as an extension of the color revolution strategy. They target countries and politicians that are enemies generally of Washington and Brussels. Of course, a disclaimer, that's not to say that the people revealed in the Pandora papers to be committing crimes are not guilty of them. In your article, you ask the question if perhaps Pandora is a CIA leak. So please give us your analysis and thoughts on the Pandora papers.
Well, I think that when these papers dropped, I just immediately, my mind, jumped back to June, and there was a White House press conference, which was on the subject of the fight against corruption. And over the course of proceedings, a senior administration official said that the Biden administration was going to place the anti-corruption plight at the center of its foreign policy. With the White House was going to prioritize this work across the board. And then in the over ensuing remarks, which were entirely unremarked and unreported on by the mainstream media, he stated, she stated that components of the U.S. intelligence committee, including the CIA, were going to be key players within this corruption fight. This would supplement the ongoing U.S. efforts to identify corruption and take appropriate policy responses, which includes funding investigative journalists and NGOs such as OCCRP, which this spokesperson added was jump-started by the US government. And indeed, yes, if you look at OCCRP's list of funders, it is an absolute roll call of US and Western state and quasi-state organizations. There was George Soros Open Society Foundations, which you mentioned, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA front, USAID, which is also a CIA front, and then there's Pierre Omidyar's Luminate. Pierre Omidyar seems to be running a kind of global regime change network with all of his media assets. There's the Ford Foundation, which used to provably count among its staff a great many, quote unquote, former CIA operatives. There's the UK Foreign Office, which is the political arm of MI6, Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service, and the US State Department. It just goes on and on and on and on. And so, what kind of picture of the world would you expect to come out of their reporting? Oh, it's one which befits the ideological and financial and political and indeed military interests of the governmental institutions that fund them, pretty much. So, yeah, that was my mind kind of spooled back to that point, which wasn't that long ago. And I just thought that White House press briefing essentially laid out a blueprint for precisely what has now been released. I'm not at all surprised by how poor the reporting on this has been. It's all this focus on lurid, like, the Czech prime minister who owns dozens of properties, and this public official somewhere that hoarded all this wealth or embezzled all these funds. It's like pretty low level attention grabbing, but also not particularly illuminating examples of malfeasance or criminality by government officials, which happens all over the world. There is a perhaps predictably, given who funds OCCRP and the ICIJ, there are virtually no references to Americans in the papers. Although this could in part be due to the fact that the US is in itself a massive tax haven, with the states of South Dakota and Delaware being internal tax havens very much. So but then equally, we know from their past, the Panama, the much trailed Panama papers, that the OCCRP has in the past ignored or failed to publish information despite it being within their overall document tranche. And so, I mean, a key example of this, and this is really quite extraordinary. Your listeners may well be familiar with convicted fraudster and pathological liar Bill Browder, who has waged this kind of very cynical war on the Russian government ever since he was banned from entering the country on national security grounds, him having spent the previous kind of decade and a half, post-communism in Russia, raping and pillaging their economy for his own personal enrichment. He's now a billionaire, although quite how many billions he has is anyone's guess. But he is named in, central to the Panama Papers was this law firm called Mossack Fonseca, who essentially offered wealthy, high net worth clients all manner of kind of tax evasion and avoidance and services and that sort of thing. And then there were certain Western politicians who were implicated in this, although often kind of rather tangentially. So, there was like the UK Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, was found to have, profited from a Panama-based trust that was established by his very wealthy father. But I mean, that's by the by and is kind of unsurprising. I mean, doesn't make it okay, of course, but I mean, everyone's got their hand in the till. But what was really, shocking was the fact that, that Bill Browder is named repeatedly in these documents, and, having used the large number of shell companies in Cyprus to insulate himself and his clients from tax on the vast profits he was making in Moscow, and disguised his ownership of lavish properties abroad, which means that he gave up his US citizenship so he didn't have to pay tax in the US, but he also owns a large number of properties in the US, such as a giant mansion in Aspen. But the ownership of that is effectively not fully hidden, but it's certainly more opaque than he's certainly taken an effort to hide this. But Browder has engaged OCCRP and used them in his kind of this kind of ongoing global crusade against Russia, and he cropped up repeatedly in media reporting on the Panama Papers, this kind of your anti-corruption campaigner and blah 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 blah, and then he's named them. And so, it's just really quite extraordinary. And I think that this speaks more generally to, how cynical and very obviously weaponized this stuff is. And so, the Guardian, in its first reports on the Pandora leaks, it featured pictures of Vladimir Putin very, very prominently, and then it had all these bizarre sentences in the resultant article saying, Vladimir Putin isn't listed by name in the document, i.e., he isn't listed in the document. Or, surprisingly, these documents do not shed light on his personal fortune. It's just like, well, I mean, there's a large number of people who aren't listed by name in these documents because they're not implicated in them. So why are you mentioning this one very specific individual? It's very, very, very bizarre. And I mean, in terms of the source of this stuff, I think, given that we have confirmation that this was, in June, that the CIA was going to be deployed to be at the forefront of this corruption, I think it's a very obvious and entirely legitimate question to ask whether this came from the intelligence services. And this is, rather actually ties in with, Bellingcat, who you mentioned. And I'm sorry that your listeners have the immense misfortune of knowing what Bellingcat is and having encountered them.
Before getting to Bellingcat, I just wanted to comment, like you mentioned Bill Browder, and we have a regular guest on the podcast is Alex Craner, who wrote...
I know him personally. He's really good people.
Yeah. He wrote the book on Bill Browder, which was suppressed. And this is one of my biggest beefs, as you're talking about. All these papers always talk about, Putin and Lukashenko, Ukrainian corrupt officials or oligarchs, and Russian and Belarus, but never American or Canadian or European, and we have so much information. Like I think it was just last week reported that officials at the Federal Reserve were involved in corruption, where they were, buying certain stocks ahead of what, kind of like insider trading. What and then we had Pelosi. It was reported just a few months ago. She was buying stocks before certain laws were going to be passed. And then by the Bidens, we know how very well corrupt the Bidens are. We've got like the laptops and things like this. And, the last time I had severe censorship on Twitter was last year when we had this whole deal with Trump and Biden and Hunter's laptop and some of these inappropriate things that were coming out. And I tried to post a link on Twitter, and I was immediately, it was the first time it happened to me. I was put like on 12-hour suspension. And so it's just crazy how, and let them post. Yeah, sure. Let's look at the corruption of the Eastern officials, but we need to also. I'm an American. I want to hold my own corrupt American officials to account, and that never happens. And I just kind of like your final thought regarding the Pandora Papers. The purpose of these leaks, you kind of alluded to it. It's just part of the ongoing hybrid war between West and East. Political war, economic war, information war. I also think it's a move toward trying to eliminate offshore secrecy jurisdictions in order to create, I think, kind of like a supranational, centralized, global system of taxation for everyone on the planet. The OECD has talked about this, and that would kind of be like creating this global centralized system where no one can escape. Just ultimately, kind of like a final thought on Pandora. What do you think is the purpose there?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned, you very rightly mentioned, economic and information warfare being, very closely interlinked here, because I think one of the really interesting, and you see this with Transparency International as well. I mean, that would be another whole podcast. But I mean, the Transparency International, they obviously do some fantastic work, and which is very, very interesting and useful. But then equally, this was founded by the World Bank in order to push neoliberalism, and it counted amongst its kind of founding members and initial kind of high-level staff, people with links to the military and intelligence services and that sort of thing. And like one of the things I find really fascinating about them is that every single year they publish the Corruption Perception Index, which is always gets enormous amounts of media coverage. As well as publishing this index, which usually features countries like Britain and the UK, sorry, Britain and the US, very high in terms of being free from corruption. Transparency will also kind of very quietly publish supplementary reports where they note that sometimes countries that perform the best on our index are often the very same that enable high levels of illicit private sector activity, money laundering, and bribery. And it's like, well, they're not a clean country, then, are they? And I think that it's very so their methodology is inherently flawed. And I think that the focus purely on public sector corruption, which is obviously a thing, and it's not ideal. But I think that actually this comes from the perspective of wanting what remains of public institutions and and kind of state or nationalized industry to be handed over to the private sector. And this was very much what Bill Browder did funnily enough, in the 90s in Russia, was that he would, by token of investing, he would get on the board of these companies and would then expose public officials to wrongdoing. But then, the whole purpose of this was in order to kind of try and compel and coerce authorities to privatize them. And his argument would be, well, this would be so much less corrupt if it was run by, if this was in private hands and blah, 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 blah. But then, what you're effectively doing, in that process is that you are turning you are switching the profiteering from local officials and politicians and authorities to private, usually Western, i.e. the US and British financiers. That's all it achieves. And and also the definitions of public and private are quite interesting. So it's like tax havens are, at least theoretically, public institutions in that anyone in theory could utilize them, but they're totally opaque, and they are not. They're usually not spoken about by these organizations. In the Pandora leaks, they specifically say that there are a number of individuals, wealthy individuals, named in these files who we will not be publishing articles on because they're not public figures, and therefore it's not in the public interest. and it's just like, well, I mean, that's a hell of a get out. You're giving yourself an awful lot of leeway to say, oh well, this person isn't famous or infamous, therefore we're not going to cover it. We're not going to cover anything related to their dodgy dealing.
Yeah, I'll include some other links as well on some interesting articles. Bloomberg's Leonid Bershitsky wrote an article on why Putin's money eludes offshore investigators. He's saying, so he's suggesting Russian kleptocrats are basically finding ways to keep their stolen wealth within Russia. There's been this, forever fascination, especially by the West, like to find dirt on Putin, and they haven't found any concrete evidence, of Putin having a stash of money. And as well, another American academic, Mark, he's a bit of a Russia hater. Mark Galeotti writes that he doesn't think anyone's really going to care about the Pandora papers, that it's really not going to do much. And sometimes I wonder, why don't governments from the East, Chinese or Russians or whoever, do this same type of leaking of information on corrupt Western officials? It's kind of interesting. Maybe they don't have such capabilities, or I don't know why. Any final thoughts on that?
I mean, but so one thing I find really interesting as well is that, like, in February, there was footage that was published by, I think it was the FSB. It was on Vladimir Shurkov, who was at the time one of Navalny's top aides, and he was on camera speaking to a representative of the British embassy, which the FSB claimed was an MI6 officer. I mean, at the very least, he was a Foreign Office official. The two are often indivisible, but I'm not sure what the truth is. It was a secret recording of him basically asking the Foreign Office official for sizable funding for Navalny's anti-corruption efforts, and this got a lot of play in the Western media and also on RT and of course and that sort of thing. But like one aspect of the video that a lot of people seem to miss, which I thought was by far the most interesting, was that Shurkov was saying to the Foreign Office official that he wanted the word put out to Western financial institutions like HSBC, which is effectively a criminal organization, or not even effectively, it's just a straight up criminal organization, that that our anti-corruption campaign doesn't pose a threat. So it's very much like it's even people on the ground in these countries, such as Russia, who claim to be interested in exposing corruption. Actually, it is purely in terms of their own government, and they understand that that corrupt entities like HSBC or Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan might find them a bit threatening, and so they want to reassure them that, hey, we're not actually a threat to you. This is all a dog and pony show. This is all an act and a facade. And then the second that we manage, if and when we manage to get rid of our own leaders, then we're going to step aside and we won't cause you any hassle. So I mean, it's just really quite extraordinary. I think that for all we hear about the kind of omniscience and omnipotence of Russian intelligence services. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I sincerely doubt that they have the level of capabilities and resources that, say, the NSA and GCHQ do. I mean, the combined CIA and NSA budget for 2020 was $85 billion, which is, more than the defense budget of any country apart from China and the US.
Yeah, and I completely forgot about that video clip. Yeah, I remember watching that. So going on to Bellingcat, that news just broke, I think, yesterday or the day before. It was announced that Russia has designated Bellingcat, as well as journalists who work for the U.S. state-run Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and UK state-run BBC as foreign agents. I think this is completely in line and fair, as the U.S. has done similar to Russian media. And it's total hypocrisy when the U.S. military information infrastructure known as Google, YouTube, has the audacity to label Chinese, Russian, Iranian, and so on channels ominously as funded by the Russian government. Yet BBC and American channels get a free pass. And many people don't know that Facebook was seed funded with public money by the Pentagon or CIA. Google, which owns YouTube, was seed funded by the Pentagon, by the government. So it's like a public-private enterprise. And now we saw recently with what's going on with the censorship with the Biden administration and Facebook, that Facebook and these social media big tech are censoring at the behest of the White House. And so, and by the way, I once had the great honor not too long ago of Elliot Higgins himself personally responding to one of my Twitter posts critical of Bellingcat. So that was kind of interesting. So what are your thoughts on this, on what's going on with Bellingcat currently?
Well, I mean, I think it's like, I mean, it's it's interesting that you jousted with him. I mean, he used to routinely argue with me on Twitter, and then I think probably because he realised I ended up making him look like a fool each and every single time, he ended up blocking me. I mean, I also have access to Foreign Office funded assessments of Bellingcat, which conclude that they are discredited due to spreading disinformation. Which he's not very happy about and refuses to comment on for obvious reasons. It's rather embarrassing for someone who sets himself up as a, kind of intellectual colossus and, uniquely moral arbiter of truth. I think that this is obviously well overdue. I'm surprised that Bellingcat haven't been subject to this designation before. I can't prove it. The kind of smoking gun remains elusive. My take on Bellingcat is that they are effectively, a clearinghouse for information, which is provided by the Western intelligence services. And indeed, Mark Urban, who is a very kind of spooky character who he's the BBC diplomatic editor who, used to work in military intelligence and is on first name terms with all manner of like MI6 spies like Pablo Miller, who was the recruiter and handler of Sergei Skripal. He is on record as saying that he thinks that the information that Bellingcat seemed to serendipitously manage to source, which is incredibly sensitive and revealing, is provided to them by the NSA and GCHQ. Whether it's, directly or via some kind of front organization, or maybe they just leave a trail of breadcrumbs for, Bellingcat to follow and kind of point them in the right direction. But I mean, that I can't prove. It's my, working assumption, and that every single one of their latest release, in quote unquote investigations, just further reinforces that. But my friend Alan McLeod, who is he's a writer for Minpress News and an academic who studies propaganda, has written a series of really fascinating articles on Bellingcat and how, they count among their staff, a number of former kind of, military and intelligence officers, including someone who spent 10 years in a senior position at GCHQ and, an ex-Stasi operative, if you can believe it, the US Secret Services. And they're also, directly funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which was, it's interesting is, the kind of historical amnesia people have about this stuff. So, when the National Endowment for Democracy was kind of launched, it was explicitly intended to serve as a kind of front for the CIA. And I think that one of their key officials has said not long, after they were instituted that, we do publicly what the CIA used to do covertly. So, we fund opposition groups and civil society initiatives in order to, undermine governments we don't like. And there's a very revealing, I think it's in 1991, it's an article in the Washington Post, which talks about how the National Endowment for Democracy is, leading the charge of spyless coups abroad, and had helped destabilize and overthrow communist governments, or ostensibly communist governments in Eastern Europe, and was working to do the same in China. And but then now today, very few people know what NED is, and when Russia, I would say very wisely, banned the National Endowment for Democracy, I believe it was 2015, they did so. The Guardian report on this merely took a quote from the organization's website to describe what they did, which was really quite shocking. But fundamentally, for all of their talk of openness and open source investigations, that they are extremely opaque. We only have their word to go on in terms of who funds them. They can often be very, very sensitive about talking too much on the nature of their funders and the kind of organizations with which they're involved. So, a key example of this is Open Information Partnership, which this was in theory, it was an initiative to teach journalists and civil society organizations and, fact checkers and think tanks in Central and Eastern Europe. It was to, tutor them in open source techniques and, improve their output and create this kind of coalition of organizations who were committed to the truth and honesty and transparency. And this was entirely funded. This is entirely funded by the Foreign Office, and to the tune of, I think it was $10 million million over 3 years. Bellingcat was one of the key founding partners of this organization. Their About section doesn't make any reference to this anymore, but at the time it said, we are a member of this organization, without any discussion of what it was or who funded it, etc. And it was indeed their involvement in this organization which gave rise to that assessment, which was so scathing of Bellingcat, and I think kind of suggests that the very reason that they're employed and promoted quite prominently is because they can be depended on to spread disinformation, false claims and that sort of thing under the guise of, objectivity. And I think that as well, I would imagine that their origins lie in the fact that, in the wake of the war on terror, the US and British intelligence services, because of the innumerable lies that they told, and indeed their heavy complicity in the torture of terror suspects, many of whom were completely innocent, and some of whom were just picked up because they had names similar to suspects. Shockingly, I think that they were heavily discredited. And this, WikiLeaks was gaining in prominence, credibility, and I think that there was probably a decision made saying, somewhere in some smoke-filled room or other, that hey, we should be doing some of this. And it means that we can, get information which, was illicitly obtained, and we wouldn't otherwise be able to, pass directly to journalists into the public domain.
Yeah, I remember 8, 9, 10 years ago when I was teaching at university, one of my dear students was sharing with me Bellingcat. And, oh, look at this new, really cool open source, investigation. And I didn't pay attention for the first, few days or few weeks. But then when I finally dug into Bellingcat, for me, it's quite obvious. I mean, you were just describing it now, and it's quite obvious that it's a front. I think they work with Atlantic Institute, NATO's think tank, which this podcast was mentioned in the same week in February when our Patreon got taken down. So who knows? Maybe they'll respond to this discussion, this podcast about them this week. So as I mentioned before, this week has been pretty crazy in terms of information warfare. We have the Pandora papers. We have the Russia declaring now BBC and Radio Free Europe journalists, as well as Bellingcat, as foreign agents, and then we had the whole Facebook fiasco. And in my opinion, this Facebook whistleblower operation could be smelled again from a million miles away. In a millisecond. My gut intuition tells me this is clearly a U.S. government Facebook false flag initiative in order to obtain greater control of the internet. And not only many are pointing this out on the left and the right, that how is it that real whistleblowers are always suppressed by the government, by social media and Twitter, yet Francis Hagen is called in to testify by Congress and opens a Twitter account, gets a verified blue check mark, gets promoted with tens of thousands of followers. Meanwhile, Project Veritas, which for the past week has been having real big pharmaceutical whistleblowers breaking stories, and they're getting completely banned from social media. They're not getting invited, to testify before Congress. And you've written an article how the Facebook whistleblower has worked with Facebook's threat intelligence unit alongside Pentagon, CIA, and NSA spies. So, what's your view on the whole Facebook whistleblower show?
Well, it's just like, you've just got to wonder whether just at this point they're not even bothering to try and hide, they're not even making any effort to make their stories believable, because it's just it just stank to high heaven from the second that I heard about it. And it's like, I think that there's a really interesting disparity between actual whistleblowers and these fake whistleblowers. So it's like, most people who actually spill information that the government don't want in the public domain, they end up in prison, they end up exiled, or they end up dead. Almost universally. Whereas then equally, the media usually does a very good job of burying them and smearing them and damaging their reputations and also just censoring and silencing them. But then also this kind of trope of the courageous crusading whistleblower who's decided to tell the truth is a very kind of compelling one. And so that they're more than happy to promote these like very obvious frauds as like, these kind of brave people who are acting in the public interest. I mean, I think that if you just look at her background, it's really fascinating. So, she graduated from an elite US university in 2006, and then goes straight into Google, which, as you say, its origins lie in an attempt to create a global surveillance tool by the CIA and NSA and the Pentagon. And then, she spends the best part of 5 years there. And then, from there, she then somewhat implausibly co-founds Hinge, and then the dating app, and then she serves as its chief technical officer. And from there, she rejoins Google, and then she works at a number of other different kind of tech firms. She joins Facebook, and then suddenly decides that actually social media is really awful, and that it's putting children at risk, and that it poses a threat to democracy. Bearing in mind that people have been warning about this for a decade, about the corrosive impact of Facebook on public debate and people's minds and perceptions, and particularly, at-risk kind of vulnerable people. That in itself is pretty unbelievable, that she would suddenly have this vault fast, but then on top of this, considered that everything she said aligns perfectly with the national security interests of the US. The US has always, Washington has for a very long time wanted to have a high degree of control over social media, to censor people, to surveil them, to just this kind of control, and prevent information or perspectives that they don't like or want to be suppressed, keep them out of the public domain. And Facebook has actually been very much a witting collaborator in this anyway. And it's just kind of inconceivable to me that if it was the case that she had seen all of all this evidence of threats of Chinese and Russian and Iranian attempts to weaponize the platform, that this wouldn't have been noticed or acted upon by the very NSA and CIA and Pentagon operatives with whom she was working in extremely close quarters. So, as you say, the Threat Intelligence Division is an absolute nest of former spies, quote unquote former, who's led by this individual called Ben Nimmo, who is, I'm not even kidding you, is a failed fantasy fiction writer and trombone player who suddenly decided that he wanted to become a propagandist for NATO, and was involved with Integrity Initiative, which was the secret Foreign Office operation to spread anti-Russian fake news around the world, which was staffed by military intelligence veterans. And it is so suspicious. And the idea that these people who have been, two senior members of the Threat Intelligence Unit, one's a former Pentagon analyst and White House National Security Council intelligence director, if you can believe it, and another is a former NSA and cyber analyst. They were the two lead authors of Facebook's State of Influence Operations report, which actually effectively said everything that Frances Haugen came out with. So it almost sounds like too farcical that anyone would fall for it. The fact that I am seemingly the only journalist in the entire world who's reported on the contents of her LinkedIn. Even, and it's funny, all of her other roles include, they always have a kind of very detailed bullet point list of her achievements and and her responsibilities, and yet Facebook is blank. It just says product manager, and it doesn't state what product she's managing or what she's doing or any of her achievements. And so then she just suddenly goes public and immediately has this blue tick verified media platform and a sit down 60-minute interview on national US broadcaster. It just doesn't make any sense, and there's no way that this is an organic kind of genuinely natural development. Maybe she does have legitimate concerns, I don't know, but she seems to have been very heavily coached. She prevents very slickly. She knows which notes to hit and what type of language to use, and speak in this very kind of punchy, pithy, sensationalist way that the media, so the media just quotes it verbatim because they don't have to dress it up any further. Yeah, I think that just more generally that on the subject of Facebook is this effective wing of state power. I mean, one thing that I find really, really interesting, and yeah, this is I've not reported on this yet, but it's coming. That the Facebook funds all manner of they call it counter extremist measures. So there's this one endeavor where, in conjunction with the UK Home Office and the US Department of Homeland Security, they fund this academic called Charlie Winter. He's a British academic, and he explores, how terror groups and other kind of maybe like QAnon or whatever, exploit social networks to perpetuate their message. And his PhD on this subject was funded by Facebook, and then now Facebook also supports his work in the International Center for Counterterrorism, which is a fairly dubious organization, which seemingly only focuses on causes of terrorism that don't include very obvious ones like, discrimination at home and Western imperialism and military adventurism in the Middle East, which are very, very obvious and kind of inarguable causes of extremism and terrorism. He heads this platform called Extract, which is, in theory, it kind of produces reports for individuals and researchers and companies working in the countering violent extremism sector, and it does this. It claims to do this using real-time tracking of Facebook and WhatsApp conversations, which seems to suggest that Facebook is granting him and indeed this platform access to privileged, sensitive data, almost undoubtedly without users' knowledge or consent. But what's really interesting is that Extract was spun out of this company called Global Strategy Network. Now, Global Strategy Network is a communications firm, quote unquote, that is what was founded and indeed was run by the MI6's former counter-terror chief, Richard Barrett. And I've written a bit about him, and his company's been running information warfare operations in Syria, and it maintains a number of very dubious, quote unquote, social listening and analysis tools, which track, much like Extract, follow communications and conversations that are happening on online and on platforms like Facebook. Now, Richard Barrett was the head of counterterrorism at MI6 before 9/11 and then until 2004 when he joined the UN. And in that context, he would have been heavily implicated in extraordinary rendition because the MI6 was the kind of lead agency along with the CIA on that, and were briefed days after 9/11 on what was going to happen. And then I think it was 2018, the British Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee found that between 2001 and 2010, the UK was implicated in hundreds of cases of torture, whether that's receiving intelligence from people they knew had been viciously tortured. And MI6 was also implicated in the kidnap and rendition of people to torture sites in, say, Libya and Syria. And they also sat in on interrogations that were happening in Guantanamo Bay, so God knows what they were witnessing. And the obvious question is whether he was there. This gets even wilder when you consider that. I'm not sure if she's a staffer or not. She's certainly listed in their papers. There's a woman called Gabi Vandenberg who is she's a Dutch political scientist who was heavily involved in SCL Group, which was the parent company of Cambridge Analytica. I think readers are probably familiar with what that is and what it did. But she set up after, I think it was it was a week before Cambridge Analytica was shut down in April 2018. She set up a company called EMIC, which it's a kind of successor of Cambridge Analytica, which kind of offers all of this, this kind of training in psychological warfare and behavioral modification to militaries. And she is named in various internal global strategy network files as a key trainer for the company. And so then we have this incredible situation in which someone tied to a firm that in Cambridge Analytica that collapsed through scandal related to the fact that it had illicitly harvested Facebook users' data without their knowledge or consent and had tried to weaponize it, who is now potentially in receiving internal Facebook data anyway, and then using it for information warfare purposes again. It's really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, this kind of brings me to my final question that I have for you, and to kind of summarize things. It seems like the propaganda isn't working anymore. Things are becoming quite obvious, and we'll be looking forward to this article you'll be publishing. But it seems like now they're moving to censor outright. As we see as the result of what the Facebook whistleblower show. The result that they want is more censorship, and we're seeing now. The two themes I kind of get from this discussion we're having is Western governments, well, I guess all governments are going against their own populations now in terms of total, digital control, getting knocked off of social media, even apps now. People, that kind of segues into that whole social credit system, vaccine passport, which is another discussion where people are getting blocked from Uber and Airbnb and can't no-fly lists and basically knocked off of social media, and then as well as this kind of getting your thoughts on the new Cold War between Washington, Brussels, and Moscow, Beijing, this information war. What are your thoughts? Where are we at in this kind of in this new Cold War?
Well, I think it's incredible to think about how quickly how quickly things are developing in this regard. It is really not very long ago that Western leaders like Barack Obama and David Cameron are sucking up to Beijing and were desperate to get Chinese money and investment. And I think that. Given that is that's only 5 years ago. I think it's really it's incredible how far we've gone from there. There's already open kind of trade war, open talk of trying to supplant or block China's One Belt One Road initiative. There's ever increasing levels of espionage and information warfare happening on both sides. The UK has effectively banned China State Broadcasting from operating in the UK not long after it set up shop there. It's coming together very, very, very fast. And I think that if anything, people getting blocked from, also just Facebook's outage the other day, and people getting blocked from all of these vital services shows that we need to create alternatives to these platforms. And we need to start building them up very quickly because, with every successive crisis or scandal, and also just due to, fake, what I would call psychological operations like the Facebook whistleblower, we're just getting more and more arguments for surveillance and, backdoors for intelligence services into private chats. We're getting, calls for censorship and banning and all of these things. And it's I saw someone the other day propose that a definition of an anti-vaxxer could be someone who's got the vaccine, but doesn't, says that people shouldn't be forced to get it. We in Colorado, the other day, I believe there was a case in which someone on a kidney transplant waiting list received a letter from their hospital saying you're getting taken off the waiting list because you've not been vaccinated. And this is bearing in mind, and something else that I wrote about quite recently was a kind of a medical professional tied to In-Q-Tel, which is the venture capital arm of the CIA, was specifically calling for people to be deprived of medical care if they refuse to get vaccinated.
Or you have the Israelis, the ones that are 3 times vaccinated. Now they are considered unvaccinated because if you don't get the 4th injection in Israel, your digital vaccine passport will not function. So there you go.
Yeah, exactly. And it's it is, I never thought I would say this, but it is very much a form of this kind of social credit system. We're a system is being created where if you don't say the right things and you don't express the express the right opinions, and don't or challenge the wrong person or say the wrong thing, and if you refuse to fall into line in all of these other key regards, then most spheres of life are going to be cut off from you. And that's I wrote an article recently about the government's proposals for vaccine passports. The UK government's proposals for vaccine passports. They're extremely stringent. They will, make life misery for an enormous number of people. If they're passed, people who, for whatever reason, aren't able to get vaccinated, or have other kind of, perfectly legitimate reasons for not wanting to do it. This is 100% a precursor to digital IDs, and there's going to be a checklist of we'll probably right down to your political opinions, dictating whether you are a good citizen or not, and it's really frightening. And I think that it needs to be opposed by people, however they can. I think that these people are very powerful. They're not omnipotent. And I think that, like I say, we need to start thinking about alternatives, not merely just to social media, but to so many aspects of things can't be centrally run anymore. We need to make things more local, and we need in order to insulate ourselves from the long arm of big tech, the security services, and governments, both our own and foreign.
Yeah, this has been an ongoing discussion on this podcast, and I totally agree. Time is running out. Things are accelerating. They're ramping up persecution, right? Censorship. Just last week, I uploaded on Rumble all 200 plus, I think it's 225 episodes of Geopolitics and Empire, so people can, if we get taken down, when we get taken down on YouTube, we're like a Hydra, right? We're on Odyssey, BitChute, Brighteon, Rumble now for the videos. And so that's what, and as well, I talked about with this popular South African podcaster, Jeremy Nell of Germ Warfare. He was discussing the idea of we need to bulletproof everything, our internet presence, and as well as you say, offline. That's getting very important now with all of these food shortages, supply shortages, and inflation prices. Again, getting depersoned, unpersoned in the real world, right? In the physical world. Some people are, getting their access to their banks, losing their access there and that sort of thing. So you're on Twitter at Kit Klarenberg. Is there any other good place to find your work or website we should know about?
You could always. I think that right now I'm primarily writing for the RT, the Cradle, which is a new Middle Eastern news outlet, which is like all original material, all like really expert stuff, which is very much challenges kind of Western media reporting on the region, which I urge all your readers to check out. And also the Grey Zone Project, which is Max Blumenthal's organization, which is again absolutely fantastic. And given their small team and limited resources, they make The Intercept look like a laughing stock with their consistently publishing scoops. I actually have an article coming out with Grey Zone very, very soon. It could be later today, in fact, on Bellingcat's links to an organization called Adam Smith International, which I was particularly happy with. And I would urge your readers to check out if they can. But thanks. It's been a pleasure, mate.
Yeah, that's all good stuff. Everyone follow Kit on Twitter and elsewhere. And again, thanks for being on Geopolitics and Empire for the first time.
Mate, my absolute pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast interview. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list through which you can receive an update of every new podcast, as well as a long list of key news headlines once a week. We're being heavily censored. YouTube has deleted some of our videos, and we currently have one strike. Patreon has terminated our account. Facebook has restricted our page, and Reddit has been deleting posts. Our favorite social media channels are Telegram and Twitter. The best places to watch the podcast beyond YouTube are on Odyssey, BitChute, and Brighteon. The best places to listen to the podcast are on SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, Google, or on any other podcast app. To help keep this podcast alive, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and wherever else, subscribe to all our platforms, and leave a donation if possible via Subscribestar, PayPal, Bitcoin, or Ethereum. You can also find us on MeWe, Minds, Gab, Float, VK, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thanks for listening.